The tragedy of Túrin Turambar, son of the mighty warrior Eärendil, began after his father's capture by Morgoth after the Doriath and Gondolin. Eärendil was cursed by Morgoth, whose malice extended to his family. His children would be doomed, and Eärendil himself was chained to Thangorodrim and forced to watch everything through Morgoth's eyes and powers. But to backtrack a bit, Túrin's tale must first begin with the history of his house. His father Eärendil was the grandson of Caldor Goldenhead, a noble lord of the Eärendil who ruled in Dor-lómin, a region in Hithlum. He became a mighty warrior and married Morwen, who was also known as Eledwin. They had 2 children, Túrin and a daughter named Erwin. Túrin was a quiet, somber child, but had a fiery spirit that was slow to forgive injustice, and loved his younger sister dearly. But one year, a plague came to Dor-lómin, and Erwin died. Túrin was stricken with grief, finding his only comfort in the words of his house's servant, Sador. But soon everything changed, for Eärendil was summoned to the host of the elven lords Fingon and Maedhros, who wished to oust Morgoth from the northern lands of Beleriand once and for all. Túrin never saw his father again after he left for the Doriath and Gondolin, for it was there Eärendil was captured by Morgoth himself, and a curse was placed on Túrin. News of the disastrous defeat of the elves, men, and dwarves soon reached Túrin and Morwen, when he was only 9 years old. Morwen was pregnant again at the time, and the cruel Easterlings now began to swarm into Dor-lómin. Eärendil's people were enslaved, his lands overrun, but Morwen and Túrin were left alone, for rumors had spread among the Easterlings that the wife of Eärendil was a devious witch with connections to the elves. Morwen and Túrin thus lived in hiding, and Morwen remembered a warning from Eärendil before he left, urging her to leave swiftly for the south should the battle go ill. But she delayed, and planned to flee Dor-lómin until after the birth of her child. For many months she waited, until at last she sent Túrin away to find the kingdom of Doriath with the help of 2 servants, where he would ask for shelter and protection. It pained Túrin greatly to leave his mother, who chose to stay behind, and this was the first of his great sorrows. Sometime later, Morwen gave birth to a daughter named Nienor, but Túrin was long gone. Túrin and his companions then passed into the forests of Brethil and the outer borders of Doriath, but became lost in the girdle of Melian. They were found and saved by Beleg Strongbow, to whom Túrin asked for the opportunity to become a knight of Thingol and ride against Morgoth. Eärendil's name was greatly honored in the elven kingdoms of old, and thus Túrin was admitted into the hidden kingdom of Doriath. Thingol took Túrin in as a foster son as the boy marveled at the wonders of Menegroth, and Túrin, for a time, was happy. Years passed, and eventually Morwen learned that Túrin had been accepted into the company of Thingol. Additionally, Thingol's wife Melian had foreseen the evils of Morgoth, and had sent messengers asking Morwen to come to Doriath as well. But Morwen had great pride, even in those days, and refused to submit herself before any king, and politely declined the request. Instead, she sent to Doriath the great Helm of Hador, a mighty helm that was built by Telkar, the renowned smith of Nogrod, and instilled fear in any and all who gazed upon it. Túrin accepted the helm, but grieved once more upon hearing of Morwen's refusal to come to Doriath. This was his second great sorrow. Túrin grew to manhood in the care of Doriath, and was briefly accompanied in his younger years by a maid named Nellis. They eventually grew apart, but Nellis continued to monitor him in secret under orders from Melian, who feared the doom set upon Túrin's name. Over 9 more years, Túrin became tall among elves and men, and his strength was renowned. He favored the sword and was pleased to learn Morwen's plight was eased, and his sister had grown into a great beauty. Beleg Strongbow, an elf of Doriath, taught him much of woodcraft. However, Túrin was notoriously stoic and unlucky, for he rarely smiled or laughed, and often his plans and designs would be beset by misfortune. Additionally, in Doriath, Túrin had one enemy, Saeros, a counselor of Thingol who had no love for the race of men, for he was a friend of Daeron the Minstrel, who had fallen in love with Luthien. Nonetheless, Túrin was of great repute by the time he was 17, and it was during this time the lands around Doriath had grown more dangerous. For Morgoth continued to grow in power, and orcs lurked around the upper Sirion, leading Thingol to seal off his borders. Túrin desired to drive back the evils he saw in the world, and feared for Morwen and Nienor. So he approached Thingol, who still looked on him like a foster son, and asked for armor and weapons and leave to march beyond Doriath. Thingol and Morwen urged for patience and restraint, but Túrin would not be swayed. He took the great dragon helm of Hador and joined the forces of Doriath. His valor and might were unquestioned, and rumor quickly spread that the helm of Dor-lómin was once again seen in the battlefield. He was accompanied by Beleg, a mighty warrior in his own right, and a fast friendship grew between them. After 3 years of fighting, Túrin, now 20 years old, returned to Doriath unexpectedly. He came into the halls of Menegroth, but by ill luck accidentally took the seat of Saeros. Saeros entered later, and perceived this as a prideful affront by Túrin. He taunted Túrin and mocked his people, provoking him to throw a glass at Saeros' face. Túrin stormed off, and Saeros was restrained by Mablung, the mighty captain and archwarden of Doriath. However, Saeros set after Túrin and attacked him in the woods outside. Despite initially being caught off guard, Túrin was a great warrior and quickly gained the upper hand over Saeros. He disarmed Saeros, but in an act of cruelty, stripped him naked and forced him to run, while Túrin chased after him with a sword in mockery. The chase was noticed by the elves of Doriath, including Mablung, who was troubled by Túrin's behavior. A terrified Saeros attempted to jump across some high rocks to escape Túrin, but slipped and fell to his death. Túrin knew he was now at the mercy of Thingol, but refused to return to Menegroth. He instead ran into the woods, becoming an outlaw. Thingol and Melian eventually learned of Saeros' death, and were initially hesitant to look upon Túrin favorably. But then Nellis appeared, and she was a witness in secret to Saeros attacking Túrin first. And the king and queen's hearts were eased, but they now wished that Túrin be found and brought back to Doriath so he could learn of his pardon. Beleg Strongbow then offered to find his friend, and chose for his journey the dark sword Anglakel. It was made of a fallen star and crafted by the dark elf Eöl, though Beleg was warned the evil nature of its maker still dwelled in the sword. Túrin, meanwhile, fled west to the woodland south of Teglin. After the Doriath and Gondolin, this land of the people of Haleth became overrun by orcs and outlaws. A notorious band of 60 or so of these men roamed the region, called the Garwaith, or Wolfmen, formerly of House Hador. Among them were Androg and their leader Forweg. The Wolfmen cornered Túrin, but perceived his might to be great and would not attack. Túrin then asked to join their company, but told them his name was Nathan, the Wronged, instead of his true identity. Thus he lived in their hard and cruel ways for a time, until one spring he came upon an outlaw chasing down a woman with a sword drawn. Túrin quickly killed the man, but soon realized it was Forweg he struck down. He was found by Androg, and they returned to the camp where Túrin claimed leadership of the band. He went unchallenged, for none of them could match him in arms. All the while, Beleg continued to search for Túrin. Orcs continued to swarm the lands, and many during this time fled to Brethil for safe haven. Túrin and an outlaw named Orleg went out to scout the orcs' strength, but they were discovered and ambushed. They killed many while fleeing, but Orleg was slain as Túrin escaped. Nonetheless, the fury of their attacks took the orcs off guard, and they fled back to the north, fearing that Túrin and Orleg were actually spies for the kingdom of Nargothrond. It was while Túrin and Orleg were away that Beleg finally found the outlaws' camp. He was imprisoned until Túrin arrived, and the two friends were at last reunited. Emotional, Túrin became driven to now defend the lands from the forces of Angband instead of continuing to live as a cruel outlaw. Beleg told him Thingol had pardoned him, but the pride of Túrin was great. He refused to return to Menegroth, claiming he instead should be the one to pardon Thingol. He resolved to lead his company now against the orcs, and Beleg reluctantly returned to Doriath. There, Thingol learned of Túrin's decision, and Melian kindly gave Beleg a piece of lembas, the elven bread traditionally reserved only for a queen, but it was given to Beleg as a gift for those he wished to aid. Now in the lands of Nargothrond there used to dwell a race of dwarves called the Nibin Nogrim, the petty dwarves. They had no friends on Middle-earth by choice except themselves, and they loathed the Noldor who stole the lands of Nargothrond from them. Originally exiles of the great dwarven cities, they eventually all died out, save for Mim and his 2 sons. And it was by chance Túrin's band came upon Mim in the Vale of Sirion, and upon capturing Mim, Túrin pitied him. He had Mim lead him to his home, for his company needed shelter. They were taken to the hill of Amon Rud, and there Mim showed them Barin Dadwit, the House of Ransom. However, it turned out Androg, mistrusting Mim, had fired an arrow into the dwelling the night before, and inadvertently killed Kim, the son of Mim. Mim then cursed Androg, and declared that he must break his bow or he would die by it. Androg eyed Mim with great hatred, but complied. So Túrin and his company began to live in Amon Rud, and learned to live off the land with the help of Mim. Months passed, but upon the arrival of winter they were found by none other than Beleg Strongbow once more. Their friendship was rekindled, but Androg now watched on in jealousy, for he had been Túrin's captain before the coming of the El. Additionally, Androg had discovered a secret way out of Amon Rud that Mim had told no one about, but he also chose to keep it hidden. To Túrin, Beleg brought the Helm of Hador, and the noble elf worked tirelessly to aid Túrin's men, who were struggling with the cold and hunger. But Mim also began to look upon him with spite, for the petty dwarves despised elves of all lands. Spring soon came, and it was now Morgoth who chose to unleash his wrath on Sirion. Túrin's company set out once more, and the terrible dragon helm of Dor Lomin soon arose once more to strike fear in the black hearts of orcs. In defiance of his curse, Androg took up a bow again, but was struck in the back by a poisoned arrow. Yet Beleg healed him, and Mim's hatred of the friend of Túrin grew ever more. The reputation of Túrin and Beleg as the 2 captains, the helm and bow, spread wide across Beleriand, and many elves and men alike flocked to their company. The hill of Amon Rud was renamed to Echad-e-Sedrin, Camp of the Faithful, but the central base's location was kept a secret from all but the original company. Túrin's forces grew mighty, to the point where Angband was even thrown back. However, they received no aid from Thingol and Doriath, or King Orodreth and Nargothrond. Túrin grew ever more prideful, and now controlled the land between Teglin and the western edge of Doriath, which he named Dor Quarthal. He renamed himself to Gorthal, the Dread Helm. Beleg began to worry that the true might of Morgoth would soon strike against them, but Túrin resolved to die defending Amon Rud and his lands. Nonetheless, I will be the captain of my own host, and if I fall, then I fall. Here I stand in the path of Morgoth, and while I so stand he cannot use the southward road. But Morgoth soon became aware of Túrin's resurgence, and now desired to capture him. For he worried the power of Túrin would grow to a point that the curse he laid on Hurin, his father, would become void. And his spies crept out, and slowly surrounded Amon Rud. Then Mim the petty dwarf, at last driven to evil, resolved to set out and betray Túrin's location to the agents of Morgoth. He attempted to negotiate a price of gold in exchange for Túrin being turned over, but the orcs took his other son, Ebun, as hostage, and Mim was forced to relent. And then the orcs crept upon Amon Rud in the dead of night, guided by Mim. Túrin and his men were caught off guard, but Androg then showed them the secret path. They made a desperate stand there, but many were slain, including Androg, who was mortally wounded by an arrow. Túrin was captured by the orcs and taken away, and Beleg, wounded, was left tied to the rocks of the stairs. Then Mim appeared over Beleg and prepared to kill him. But Androg, in his dying breath, lunged at Mim with a sword, who ran down the hill screaming. Androg freed Beleg before dying, and Beleg then set out to find Túrin once again. The trail of the orcs, Beleg knew, would lead to Angband. He followed one party into Tar Nu Fuin, the forest under night, a land of great despair. There he found a sleeping elf and gave him Melian's lembas. The elf was none other than Gwyndor, a survivor of Fingon's army from the Doriath and Gondolin. He had escaped from captivity under Morgoth, but had lost his hand in his flight. Gwyndor was inspired to join Beleg's quest, and the two elves soon found an orc encampment within sight of the Thangorodrim itself. They snuck into the camp and found Túrin tied to a tree, seemingly in a drugged stupor. His binds were cut, but in a stroke of misfortune, Beleg drew his sword Anglakel and pricked Túrin's foot. And Túrin awoke, and mistakenly believed Beleg to be an orc come back to torment him. He wrestled Anglakel away from Beleg and slew him. A flash of lightning illuminated the fallen captain's face, and Túrin then realized what was done as Gwyndor cowered on the ground. As thunder roared from the west, Túrin stood unmoving, terribly silent, as Gwyndor urged him to run. Morning came, and the orcs returned to Angband, believing Túrin to be long lost. He and Gwyndor buried Beleg, and took Anglakel and what was left of the lembas. Thus ended Beleg's strongbow, truest of friends, greatest in skill of all that harbored in the woods of Beleriand in the elder days, at the hand of him whom he most loved. And that grief was graven on the face of Túrin and never faded. Gwyndor led Túrin back over Sirion, who had seemed to become speechless and mad in grief. But at last he was cured upon drinking from the springs of Aethel Ivrin, and the two continued their journey until they were captured by the scouts of the elves. Thus Túrin then arrived at the kingdom of Nargothrond, one of the last bastions of elven strength in Beleriand. Gwyndor returned to his people and Orodreth, his king. He was warmly welcomed by his betrothed, Finduilas, Orodreth's daughter. Túrin simply introduced himself as Ag Garwain, the Bloodstained, once again hiding his ancestry from the legendary warrior Hurin. In Nargothrond, however, he became known as Mormogil, the Black Sword, for Anglakel was reforged and christened by Túrin as Gurthang, Iron of Death. Because of his vast skill in combat, Túrin quickly became a part of Orodreth's council. However, the elves of Nargothrond at this time fought Morgoth using techniques of stealth, ambush, and the bow, something Túrin did not naturally agree with. Thus he counseled them to instead marshal their arms and march out against Morgoth in open battle. Gwyndor did not support this strategy, for he had seen the power of Morgoth while captive in Angband. He also knew that centuries ago, the might of the Edain and elves was only sufficient enough to maintain a loose siege of Morgoth, and on its own, Nargothrond stood no chance. Only in secrecy lies hope of survival, until the Valar come. But Túrin forsook the Valar, claiming they had abandoned the men of Middle-earth, and his words swayed Orodreth, and Nargothrond shed its cloaks of secrecy. Gwyndor fell out of favor, and Finduilas even began to turn her eyes and heart to Túrin. And though she did not know his true origins, she named him Thurin, the Secret, as the friendship between Túrin and Gwyndor cooled as the days passed. Gwyndor soon came to guess that Túrin was indeed kin of Hurin and subject to the curse and doom laid upon the family. And he approached Finduilas and told her his suspicions, that Túrin's doom would befall her should their love continue. Finduilas confronted Túrin, who then found Gwyndor and asked why the elf would betray his identity. For Túrin was determined to not associate himself as the son of Hurin for the purpose of avoiding the curse placed upon him. But Gwyndor answered, "The doom lies in yourself, not your name." It was during this time, when Morgoth was driven back from Sirion, that Morin and Nienor came to Doriath seeking shelter, and found it under the house of Thingol. Meanwhile, 5 years passed in Nargothrond, and Túrin rose in prominence, becoming the de facto military leader of the Elvish warriors. Then two elves, Gelmir and Arminas, came to the kingdom as heralds from the Valar Olmo. They were tasked with finding the hidden kingdoms of Nargothrond and Gondolin, and though Gondolin and Turgon they could not find, to Nargothrond and Orodreth they issued an ominous warning. For Gelmir and Arminas were dwelling with Círdan the shipwright in the mouths of the Sirion, and Olmo himself sent them to warn Orodreth a great danger would soon befall Nargothrond. They urged the king to shut his doors, destroy the great bridge over the river Narog, and remain hidden. But Orodreth turned to Túrin for counsel, and in his pride mistrusted Gelmir and Arminas, and ignored the warning from Olmo and Círdan. But the words of Gelmir and Arminas soon came to fruition, as soon after their departure Eärendil, the lord of Brethil, was slain by orcs and the black forces of Morgoth began to consolidate in the pass of Sirion. Then that autumn, Morgoth struck at Narog, sending forth Glaurung the Golden, father of dragons. Aethel Ivrin was destroyed, and Glaurung came into the realm of Nargothrond, burning the guarded plain of Talath Durnan. Túrin, terrible and mighty and true to his word, led the forces of Nargothrond out in open battle on Tumhalad, but the hosts of Morgoth far surpassed the might of the elves, and they were driven back. There Orodreth, king of Nargothrond, fell in battle, and Gwyndor was mortally wounded. As he lay dying, he reconciled with Túrin and asked him to find Finduilas, foretelling that she alone was capable of preventing his doom. If you fail her, it shall not fail to find you. Then Túrin sped towards Nargothrond, but Glaurung and his army were already there. And there the bridge of Narog, built by Túrin, proved to be another evil, for it hastened the advance of the enemy through the doors of Felagund. Nargothrond was sacked, and Túrin desperately fought through the dying kingdom searching for Finduilas. Glaurung then appeared, and with his gaze cast an evil spell on Túrin, who found himself rooted in place, unable to move. Evil have been all your ways, son of Hurin, thankless fosterling, outlaw, slayer of your friend, thief of love, usurper of Nargothrond, captain foolhardy, and deserter of your kin. The orcs began leading away their captives, which included Finduilas. Upon seeing a frozen Túrin, she cried out, but was led away, her voice to haunt Túrin forever after. Glaurung then freed Túrin from the spell, and Túrin immediately leapt forward to attack the dragon. But Glaurung instead allowed him to go free seemingly out of pity and respect for his valor, and told him to go to Dor Lomin, where he would find Morwen and Nienor. Thus fell Nargothrond, one of the great hidden kingdoms of the Eldar, and Túrin journeyed north, haunted by the cries of Finduilas and fearing for Morwen and Nienor. However, he was unaware at this time Morwen and Nienor were actually safe from Morgoth and Doriath. A fell winter with cruel cold came upon Beleriand, and it would last for 5 long months. At long last he passed into Dor Lomin to find Morwen and Nienor gone. Túrin was distraught, for this was a deception by Glaurung, who continued to grow in size and power in Nargothrond. In his family house, he found sitting in power Brada the Incomer, a cruel Easterling who had forcibly taken Eärendil, a kinswoman of Hurin, to wife. Túrin asked for shelter in the house of Brada, and asked for news of the land and Morwen. He came across none other than his childhood friend Sador, who told him Morwen and her daughter had long fled the abuses of Brada. Túrin then strode into Brada's hall and confronted the Easterling, and asked the Lady Eärendil for more information about Morwen. But Eärendil feared Brada's wrath and claimed to know nothing. So Túrin leapt forward and grabbed Brada by the hair and held his dread sword Anglakel to his throat. And there he learned his family was in Doriath and came to be aware of the full extent of Glaurung's trickery. He grabbed Brada and held him in the air and threw him into another Easterling. Brada died, his neck broken, and the hall broke out into fighting. For though the Easterlings rose to challenge Túrin, so too did the elder inhabitants of Dor Lomin in rebellion against the usurpers. Sador was mortally wounded, and urged Túrin to flee with his dying breaths. So Túrin ran from the house with a band of rebels, who led him to a winter camp in the mountains. Túrin ventured back into Sirion, and decided to renew his search for Finduilas, as he believed Nienor and Morwen to be safe now within the girdle of Melian and Doriath. But the trail of Finduilas had gone terribly cold, and Túrin could not find her but came into the forest of Brethil. There he found the remnants of the people of Haleth. They were led by Brandir, son of Handir, and Túrin by chance encountered a small hunting party beset by orcs. Using the brush as cover and feigning as if he was a much larger party, Túrin drove the orcs away, waving his sword Gurthang above his head. The men of Brethil offered Túrin a chance to dwell with them, but Túrin declined, asking of Finduilas' whereabouts. Unfortunately, he learned the men had encountered another group of orcs who had slain all their captives. Finduilas was among those killed, stabbed to a tree with a spear. Túrin was brought to Teglin, where the daughter of Orodreth was buried. He collapsed, a darkness falling upon him, but the men of Brethil now knew him to be Mormogil, great captain of Nargothrond, and bore him away to their leader Brandir. Brandir recognized him immediately as Túrin, but took him into his care knowing full well the doom wrought on the kin of Hurin. Túrin awoke and vowed to live a life of peace from there on out, renaming himself again to Turambar, Master of Doom. He became part of the men of Brethil and set aside his sword in favor of a bow and spear. The fell winter then came to the land, and the kingdom of Doriath, Morwen and Nienor included, learned of the fall of Nargothrond and the presumed death of its captain Mormogil. Morwen thus feared Túrin to be dead, and asked Thingol for leave to find the truth of what happened. Both Thingol and Melian urged her to not leave, believing that desire was the subtle work of Morgoth. Yet Morwen decided to venture out, and for her protection Thingol sent a company of marchwards, including the great Mablung. Nienor snuck behind, trailing the party, and upon her discovery they were forced to take her along on the search. Several days later, they at last arrived at the hill of Amon Ethir, where they saw the abandoned walls of Nargothrond, but no sign of Glaurung the Golden. Mablung led his men inside to explore, but they were unaware that Glaurung had been aware of their arrival all along. And the dragon sprung out of hiding, and the riders issued a quick warning to Morwen and Nienor. But Glaurung slithered into the river Narog, and terrible fumes and smoke spewed into the air. A fog settled over Morwen and Nienor's horses, and they scattered in a panic. Nienor became separated from everyone else and was thrown from her horse. By ill chance, she came across Glaurung, and in the depths of his eyes she saw the malice of Morgoth, his master. And Glaurung set his will against Nienor, and she was overpowered and fell unconscious, losing her memory in the process. Mablung, meanwhile, explored Nargothrond, still searching for Túrin, yet he found no living thing, and fled as Glaurung returned to his lair. The dragon mocked Mablung, who continued to run and eventually found Nienor still in a stupor. They were found by several of the other riders and began the journey back to Doriath. However, one night they were attacked by orcs, and Nienor fled in a fright, a surprising speed stealing her away from elf and orc alike. Mablung returned to Doriath having lost Morwen and Nienor, and bid Thingol let him resign as captain of the hunters. The king and Melian forgave Mablung, but for 3 more years he continued the search for the missing kin of Hurin. Nienor, meanwhile, continued to run through the woods. Her clothes became lost, and at last her madness ended, but she fell into a deep sleep. Upon awakening, her memories were still gone, and she lived more as beast than woman. She passed into the forest of Brethil, and by chance settled on the grave of Finduilas. And then Túrin, leading a band of hunters, discovered her. But to Túrin, she was merely a maiden with no memory, and he did not know she was actually his sister. He named her Niniel, Maid of Tears, and took her into the company of Brethil, where she seemed to only find comfort by the side of Túrin himself. Niniel, or Nienor, recovered over time, and Brandir eventually came to love her. But she was still only happy around Túrin, as a time of peace came over Brethil. Túrin eventually asked Niniel for her hand in marriage, but Brandir feared the shadow he saw lingering over the man he knew as Turambar, and still sought to delay her. Though Niniel was persuaded to wait, Túrin pressed on, and they were married in the spring, where he made a vow to never return to war again. Elsewhere, Glaurung the Golden continued to grow in strength in the ruins of Nargothrond. His numbers of orcs swelled, and he began to attack Brethil, for it was there that dwelled the last of the houses of men loyal to the elves. Glaurung also knew Túrin was still alive, and astutely guessed he would be dwelling with the men of Brethil. Thus the vow of Túrin was mightily tested, for these orcs were a new, cruel breed, and outclassed the woodsmen in combat. Then Túrin forsook the vow, and took Gurthang into battle once more, and hundreds flocked to his side. The orcs were driven back, and a furious Glaurung knew that Túrin had resurfaced, but opted to bide his time. Winter passed in peace, and in the spring Niniel became pregnant, but became a shadow of herself, devoid of happiness. News then reached Brethil of fires to the north, caused by Glaurung himself. Greatly worried, Túrin decided to set out and defeat the dragon once and for all, but using stealth and cunning rather than meeting Glaurung in open battle. Many of the woodsmen feared the doom of their leader, but two, Dorlas and Hunthor, volunteered to go with Túrin. Niniel begged him to stay, but he would not be swayed from his course. So Túrin and his companions went to Nen Girith, where they learned Glaurung would cross the Teglin at Cabed en Aras. It was a dangerous moment for Túrin and his men, for the crossing would be over sheer cliffs. Meanwhile, back in Brethil, Brandir confronted Niniel about her decision to marry Túrin despite his counsel to do otherwise. Niniel feared for Túrin still, and decided to set out and find him, resigning herself to whatever fate the doom held for her. Many people of Brethil followed her, for they had great faith in Túrin. Brandir despaired at the weakening of his leadership, and forsook his position and followed the march. Túrin, Dorlas, and Hunthor arrived at the cliffs of Cabed en Aras, but only Túrin and Hunthor made the dangerous crossing, as Dorlas remained behind out of fear. So they continued along the drop until they heard Glaurung somewhere above them. Túrin planned to sneak under the dragon as he crossed and stab him in the belly, and they decided to wait to determine Glaurung's exact point of crossing. After waiting some time, the moment came. Terror came with him, for he did not begin his passage right above, but a little to the northward, and the archers from beneath could see the huge shadow of his head against the stars, and his jaws gaped, and he had 7 tongues of fire. Túrin clambered forward to strike, and nearly fell but was saved by Hunthor. Then a falling rock struck Hunthor in the head, and he fell to his death in the river below. Túrin despaired, for it seemed his doom led all who aided him to their deaths, but he found new strength and climbed up. Then Turambar drew the black sword of Beleg and stabbed upwards with all the might of his arm and of his hate, and the deadly blade, long and greedy, went into the belly even to its hilts. Glaurung let out a terrible scream and writhed on the far side of the ravine, and laid there in a smoking ruin. Túrin managed to climb up and stand in front of his foe's body, the black sword still in his belly. Túrin reveled in his victory and moved to draw his sword out, but a spurt of dragon blood hit his hand. He cried out, and Glaurung opened his eyes, staring at Túrin with pure hatred. Túrin swayed and fainted, appearing dead to the people of Brethil who then arrived, having heard the commotion. They dared not approach the site of the attack, for the Watchers had only relayed the great outburst of Glaurung, and believed him to be rampaging across the river. Túrin was also presumed to be defeated. Niniel sat upon a height, frozen in fear upon hearing the news. Brandir attempted to comfort her, and led her to the crossings of Teglin, believing they needed to flee from the wrath of Glaurung. But Niniel came to her senses, and broke away from him. He was rapidly outpaced owing to a limp and bad leg, but by chance they both encountered the sight of the fallen Glaurung and Túrin. Niniel alone approached the bodies, and was unaware of Brandir lurking behind her in the shadows. She threw herself upon Túrin, begging him to stir, but it was Glaurung who awoke instead for the last time. Hail Nienor, daughter of Hurin. We meet again ere we end. I give you joy that you have found your brother at last. And now you shall know him, a stabber in the dark, treacherous to foes, faithless to friends, and a curse unto his kin, Túrin, son of Hurin. Glaurung then died after accomplishing this last evil, for Nianor's memories now cleared, and she was overwhelmed with anguish, for she now at last knew she had married her brother and was pregnant by him. Brandir appeared as she ran to the banks of the river, urging her to wait. But Nienor, daughter of Hurin, would not heed him, and cast herself into the waters, ending her life. From then on, Cabed en Aras was known as Cabed Nehramarth, the Leap of Dreadful Doom. Brandir then began to walk away from the still body of Túrin, but encountered Dorlas. He realized Dorlas had abandoned his companions and shamed him. Dorlas attacked Brandir, but Brandir was ready and struck first, killing him. The people of Brethil then arrived and were told that Glaurung, Niniel, and presumably Túrin were all dead. Brandir decreed the land of Brethil to have fallen under the shadow of Hurin's doom, and renamed it to Sarch Nia Chin Hurin, Grave of the Children of Hurin. The woodsman then left to build a grave for Túrin, who at that moment stirred and came to. He walked back to Nen Girith, chancing upon the shocked people of Brethil. Brandir was floored, and Túrin asked of Niniel. Brandir told him of how he saw Niniel leap from the cliffs and revealed her true identity of Nienor. Then Túrin seized and shook him, for in those words he heard the feet of his doom overtaking him, but in horror and fury of his heart would not receive them. He admitted to being Túrin, son of Hurin, but refused to believe that Niniel was actually his sister. Brandir refused to back down, gloating at the curse of Túrin. And Túrin drew Gurthang and cut down Brandir, and the people of Brethil fled from his wrath. He then wandered the woods, and convinced himself that Niniel must be safe in Doriath. Then Mablung, chief huntsman of Thingol, and a small company of elves found Túrin. They rejoiced upon learning of the death of Glaurung, but were confused upon hearing the tale of Niniel. For Túrin had never seen his sister as an infant, and believed her to have dark hair like himself and unlike Niniel, who was blonde. But Mablung shattered his world, telling him Nienor, his sister, did indeed have golden hair and thus matched the profile of Niniel. A distraught Túrin raced away from the elves, who did not know the full extent of the situation, and reached the banks of Cabed Nehramarth once more. He drew Gurthang and thrust himself upon its point, taking his own life. Mablung then came upon the bodies of Túrin and Glaurung, and lamented his role in the tragic events. I also have been meshed in the doom of the children of Hurin, and thus with words have slain one that I loved. Gurthang was broken, and the body of Glaurung was burned to ashes, but Túrin was buried in a mound with a large stone, upon which read, Túrin Turambar Dagnir Glaurunga, and Nienor Niniel, though her body was never found. The tragedy of Túrin would have lasting effects on the realm of Beleriand, as now the evils of Morgoth would be manifested through the release of Hurin. Now a broken man, Hurin was freed by Morgoth, who secretly intended to use him to orchestrate the downfall of Thingol and Melian in Doriath. Thus, after 28 long years of captivity and suffering, Hurin, the greatest warrior of the race of men, re-entered the realm of Beleriand. His heart was bitter and longed for peace, and his first journey was to find the hidden city of Gondolin, where he hoped to reunite with his old friend Turgon. After being shunned by the remnants of his people, for they feared he was in league with Morgoth, Hurin found the encircling mountains. He could not locate the entrance to Gondolin, however, and cried out in despair, asking for the aid of Turgon and the Eagles. This was watched and observed by Turgon and the Eagles, though Turgon was wary of Hurin's intentions and thus did not reveal himself to his old friend. Despondent, Hurin left the mountains, but his movement was tracked by the spies of Morgoth. The enemy now knew the rough location of Gondolin, though the city itself still remained hidden. Now more jaded than ever, Hurin wandered for a time more until he came to Cabed Nehramarth and the gravesite of Túrin Turambar. There he was reunited with his wife Morwen, a shadow of herself. They spent the night together and she died in her sleep. Hurin buried her by a river and carried on, his doom and the shadow of Morgoth still following him. He came to the ruins of the fallen kingdom of Nargothrond, where sat Mim the petty dwarf, having claimed its treasures after the defeat of Glaurung. Men pleaded for his life upon learning Hurin was the father of Túrin, but Hurin showed no mercy and killed him where he stood. He wandered amidst the scattered and forgotten treasures of Valinor, and then came across the Nauglamir, unspoiled. In this he took to King Thingol and Doriath, and a great evil was accomplished by Morgoth. Hurin threw the Nauglamir at the feet of Thingol, scorning and mocking the king. But Thingol looked on Hurin with pity, and Melian approached Hurin and reminded him how they had raised Túrin as a child. Hurin was moved, and formally gifted them the Nauglamir. He passed out of Menegrath, decreeing his doom fulfilled. His life void of purpose and hope now, he vanished from the tales of elves and men thereafter, and it was said he cast himself into the sea. But now Thingol and Doriath had come into possession of two of the great treasures of Middle-earth, the Nauglamir and a Silmaril. He decided to merge the two, and commissioned the dwarves of Nógrad to the task. However, upon completion, the dwarves laid claim to the Nauglamir by their ancestral right, but Thingol knew the Silmaril was their true desire. He scorned the dwarves, mocking them and bidding them to leave Doriath without payment. But the lust overtook the dwarves, and they attacked Thingol and killed him, fleeing with the Nauglamir. The Sindar ruthlessly pursued them, killing without mercy, and managed to reclaim the treasure. However, two dwarves managed to escape and relay news of the killing of their kin to Nógrad, and a great host was assembled, though without the aid of the dwarves of Belegost. Meanwhile, Melian foresaw the fall of Doriath on the horizon. Though a Maya, she took an elven form, and her power was bound to Arda and the girdle of Melian following her union with Thingol. After his death, that power subsided to the forest of Neldoreth, exposing Doriath to the outside world. She gave the Silmaril to Mablung, a captain of the Sindar, and urged him to warn Beren and Luthien of the incoming attack. Melian then departed from Middle-earth and left for Valinor. The host of the Naugrim from Nógrad then arrived at Menegrath. At the devastating battle of the Thousand Caves, thousands of dwarves and elves lost their lives. Mablung fell defending Thingol's vaults, and the Nauglamir and Silmaril were taken. All the while, Beren and Luthien were living in Tol Galen with their son Dior, by now a grown man. Dior had married Nimloth, a relative of Celeborn, a prince of Doriath. They had two sons, Ellared and Elurin, and a daughter named Elwing. Upon hearing of the fall of Doriath and the theft of the Silmaril, Beren, Dior, and the Green Elves of Osirian set out and attacked the beleaguered dwarves. The fleeing dwarves were slaughtered by the Ents of the forest, and Beren himself slew the Lord of Nógrad. The treasures of Doriath fell into the river Ascar, which was named Rathloriel, the Golden Bed. The Nauglamir was taken to Tol Galen, where Luthien donned it and was a picture of unmatched beauty. Dior, the heir of Thingol, then departed for Doriath to rebuild the kingdom with his family. After a time, one autumn night, Dior was visited by a messenger and given the Nauglamir, indicative of Beren and Luthien passing from Middle-earth. Then Dior arose, and about his neck he clasped the Nauglamir. And now he appeared as the fairest of all the children of the world, of threefold race, of the Edain, and of the Eldar, and of the Maiar of the Blessed Realm. But new danger now arose, for the sons of Feanor, still bound by their oath, learned of the Silmaril passing to Dior in Doriath. They had not dared to attack Luthien before, but now sent an ultimatum to Dior, which was not responded to. So Celegorm led an attack against Doriath, known thereafter as the Second Kinslaying. Doriath was destroyed, and Dior the Fair was killed after slaying Celegorm. The brothers Curufin and Caranthir also lost their lives. Nimloth, Dior's wife, was killed, and his two sons were captured and left in the forest to starve, where no living being ever saw them again. However, some of Dior's people fled to the mouths of the river Sirion, and among them was Dior's daughter Elwing, who had the Silmaril. Our tale begins with the fallout of the Doriath and Gondolin. News of the devastating victory of Morgoth reached Dorloman in the ears of Rian, wife of Tuor, the brother of Hurin. She knew her husband had fallen, and despaired and fled into the woods. There she was found by the Sindar, the Grey Elves, and it was in their care she gave birth to a son. He was named Tuor, and he was consequently the cousin of Túrin Turambar. But so distraught was Rian at the death of Tuor that she left Tuor to the care of the elves and journeyed to the Hill of Tears in the Enfoglith, where she died. But Tuor grew to be a man of great might with the Sindar, his strength and valor rivaling the princes of the noble Edain. Eärendil, a survivor from the Doriath and Gondolin, was the leader of the Sindar who fostered Tuor. After that infamous battle, however, Morgoth betrayed the treacherous Easterlings, who were instrumental in the defeat of the Union of Maedhros. They were denied the lands and holdings promised to them, and were instead sent to Hithlum. There, hateful against Morgoth, but more so against the elves and the remnants of the House of Hador, they fell upon the people of Hithlum. Eärendil led Tuor and his people away from the chaos in the north, and Tuor, upon reaching the age of 16, resolved to strike against the oppressors of his people. But Eärendil urged caution, saying Morgoth could not be overthrown until Thangorodrim was broken, and that Tuor's fate laid elsewhere. Instead, they planned to make for Anon in Gelid, the gate of the Noldor. Then Tuor learned of Turgon, the elven lord and now High King of the Noldor, who his father had aided in the Doriath and Gondolin. Still a young man burning with a desire for battle, he asked for leave to seek Turgon. But Eärendil said Turgon was hidden in his kingdom, and its location was unknown to both elf and man, and so Tuor reluctantly agreed to travel south with him. But their group was soon attacked by Easterlings and orcs, and became scattered. Tuor fought valiantly, killing many foes, but was at last taken captive by Lorgan the Easterling, who proclaimed himself ruler of Dorloman. Tuor labored for 3 years as a slave of Lorgan before managing to escape. He fled to the caves of Androth, his old home with the elves. There he dwelt for 4 more years as an outlaw, gaining a notorious reputation among the Easterlings, who set a great bounty upon his head. And Tuor constantly searched for the Gate of the Noldor, but could not find it. Despairing, one day he sat by a spring and began to play his harp. Unknown to him, Olmo, Valar of the Seas of Middle-earth, looked down on him and his family favorably, and believed Tuor could play a key role in the elven cause. Thus, as Tuor played his harp and sang, a well overflowed, and a stream began to flow down the rocky hillside. He followed it for 3 days, coming within sight of Eärendil. Then 2 elves found him by chance, and introduced themselves as Gelmir and Armanas. They led Tuor to the Gate of the Noldor before leaving. He traveled for several more days, captured by the sound of rushing water around him, and eventually came to the echoing mountains of Lamoth. This was where Feanor had first landed on his quest to reclaim the Silmarils from Morgoth. Tuor looked to the sky and saw 3 great white gulls, beloved birds of the Teleri, and followed them. He passed into the plain of Nevrast, and thus came to the western border of the land of Middle-earth. And at that hour the sun was down beyond the rim of the world, as a mighty fire, and Tuor stood alone upon the cliff with outspread arms, and a great yearning filled his heart. It is said he was the first of men to reach the great sea, and that none, save the Eldar, have ever felt more deeply the longing that it brings. Tuor stayed by the sea for some time, but was then guided by several swans to travel south, and he found the abandoned ancient city of Vinyamar, the old dwelling of Turgon himself before the founding of Gondolin. Exploring the city, he followed the swans to a great hall, where there he found the ancient armor of Turgon, the very suit of arms that Olmo had warned the king about so long ago. For if a messenger should appear before him, it was an omen from Olmo foretelling the doom of the kingdom. And now the curse of Mandos hastens to its fulfillment, and all the works of the Noldor shall perish, and every hope which they build will crumble. Tuor donned the armor and walked down to the shore below, where Olmo himself appeared. He beseeched Tuor to find the hidden city of Gondolin and taught him the ancient lore of the Eldar, of the darkening of Valinor, the doom of Mandos, and the exile of the Noldor. Omo warned Tuor the curse of Mandos was hastening, and Tuor doubted the impact he could make. But the Valar encouraged him, stating he was worthy of this great errand. For the valor of the Edain the elves shall ever remember as the ages lengthen, marveling that they gave life so freely of which on earth they had so little. But it is not for thy valor only that I send thee, but to bring into the world a hope beyond the sight, and a light that shall pierce the darkness. For Omo knew the Eldar was weakening on Middle-earth as Morgoth strengthened. He could sense its fading as the waters, and consequently his powers, were slowly poisoned. But in Tuor he saw a great hope, and promised to send a guide to help him on his quest. Tuor went back to Vinyamar to find shelter, for it was a stormy night. As he slept, he had a dream of a steep mountain on an isle with dancing shadows, but above it there shone a brilliant star. The following morning he found his guide, who turned out to be Voronwë. Voronwë was the only surviving mariner of the ships Turgon had sent to find Valinor. The two then set out to find the gates of Gondolin. They traveled east and came across the defiled spring of Ivrin. Then they heard a voice, and hid in the shadows as a figure appeared. It was a man, clad in armor and standing tall and mighty with a terrible black sword. Unknown to the companions, it was actually Túrin Turambar, cousin of Tuor, searching for Finduilas after the fall of Nargothrond. Tuor would never see him again. The journey continued, with Voronwë and Tuor powering through the 5-month-long fell winter. After evading orcs and taking many back roads, Voronwë showed Tuor the hidden road that led to Gondolin. They approached the towering and circling mountains, and found a tunnel at the base of a cliff. Far into the tunnel they went, until a voice addressed them in High Elvish and the language of Beleriand. Then Alemekil, captain of the guard of Gondolin, strode out and asked Voronwë why he had returned and brought a mortal man with him. They requested an audience with Turgon, telling Alemekil of Tuor's quest. Thus they were led onward, and soon came across the first of the 7 gates. The 7 gates were a series of security posts of sorts protecting the way to Gondolin, and marked a journey of several dozen miles just to reach the city. Tuor and Voronwë passed through all 7. The gate of wood, the gate of stone, the gate of bronze, the gate of writhen iron, the gate of silver, the gate of gold, and the gate of steel. All were marvels of elvish architecture manned by guards adorned with themed armor, with the last gate being constructed by Maeglin, son of Eöl and Eärendil. The warden of the Gate of Steel, the Great Gate, rode out on horse to meet Tuor and Voronwë. He was Ecthelion, Lord of the Fountains. All in silver was he clad, and upon his shining helm was a spike of steel pointed with a diamond. And as his esquire took his shield, it shimmered as if it were bedewed with drops of rain, that were indeed 1,000 studs of crystal. You have come to the last gate. Know then that no stranger who passes it shall ever go out again, save by the door of death. Then Tuor spoke, but it seemed disattached from his body, for Omo spoke through his mouth and demanded Tuor be taken to Turgon. So Ecthelion led Tuor through the last gate, and at last he saw the great city of Gondolin, in the midst of fallen white snow. He looked upon a contingent of the army of Gondolin, tall and strong and representing each of the 7 gates, and they in turn marveled at Tuor in wonder, for he had shed his cloak and now showed them the armor of Omo given to Turgon hundreds of years ago. Tuor was led into the stunningly beautiful city, where he made his way to the king's palace, the tallest tower in Gondolin. All around him were creations of white marble, unsurpassed beauty, and the air was filled with the songs of birds and the shimmering colors of the mists of fountains. Approaching the tower of Turgon, there were also 2 trees, one gold and one silver. Their light was glorious, for they were the offspring of the two original trees in Valinor, and the Gondolindrim called them Glingol and Bansal. Turgon strode towards Tuor, who addressed him with a power and majesty in his voice bestowed by Ulmo. Tuor urged Turgon to prepare for battle, but the king would not listen to the warnings of Ulmo and the Valar, for he was proud of his city and was reluctant to venture forth and risk its strength and beauty that had lasted centuries. Tuor then asked him to seek for Valinor itself by traveling to Sirion, but Turgon pushed back again, telling him all messengers sent prior had never returned. So it was decided that Gondolin would do nothing, but Tuor and Voronwë were allowed to reside in its halls. So Tuor came to live among the elves in the great city, and eventually his heart fell to Eärendil, the beautiful daughter of Turgon. His skill and wisdom grew to surpass his forebears in crafting, knowledge, and music. He was beloved by its people, and was gifted a great suit of armor by Turgon, which he wore with his axe named Dramborleg. Turgon also granted him lordship and command over his own people within Gondolin, which would become the House of the Wing. And life was peaceful and prosperous, and over time the warnings of Ulmo seemed to fade. After some years, Tuor and Eärendil fell in love and were married, one of the rare unions of elf and man in the history of Middle-earth. All of Gondolin rejoiced at this with the exception of one elf, Maeglin. The son of Eöl and Eärendil, sister of Turgon, had grown to be mighty in skill and honor, and was among the best craftsmen of Gondolin. Yet he too had long coveted the heart of Eärendil, and unfortunately for him, she had not only shunned him for some time, but even loathed him. Maeglin had always been bitter about this, but his dark nature grew upon the marriage of Eärendil and Tuor, who he grew to hate. Tuor and Eärendil then had a son with sparkling blue eyes, and he was named Eärendil. But meanwhile, in the greater part of Beleriand, Morgoth continued to consolidate his power, for Gondolin was the last bastion of elven strength that remained to oppose him. And spies were sent every which way to search for Turgon in the city, and news soon reached the king that foul creatures of Morgoth had been sighted on the peaks of the encircling mountains. While Turgon prepared the city defenses but still made no plans to flee, Eärendil, showing keen foresight, devised a secret plan of her own, for she mistrusted Maeglin and confided to Tuor she would commission the building of a secret escape route from Gondolin. But then by ill chance, Maeglin was captured by a party of orcs while mining for ore, and he was taken to Morgoth himself, and after being threatened, the evil in his heart won. Maeglin helped Morgoth devise a plan to overthrow Gondolin, for he knew much of its defenses and strength in arms. Morgoth promised him captaincy in his army and Eärendil herself upon the city's fall, but the black foe of the world held no true desire to fulfill his word. Maeglin was allowed to return to the city, and the mustering of forces on both sides began in earnest. Seven years passed after the return of Maeglin, and while Tuor and Eärendil remained wary, Turgon grew complacent and felt it prudent to reduce the watch on the walls. For though Turgon was truly a great and noble king, his pride in the strength of the city and trust in Maeglin would be his ruin. Winter came and went in Gondolin, where spirits were still high and Morgoth seemed a distant threat. Then spring arrived, and a great festival was held. Nas na Lothion it was called, and it went through the night, with the elves falling silent at midnight, awaiting the first sign of dawn to break into song. The first light came, and many flocked to the high walls to begin the celebration. Yet the light was odd, and came from the north, and not the east. Then wonder grew to doubt, as the light waxed and became yet redder, and doubt to dread, as men saw the snow upon the mountains dyed as if it were blood. And thus it was the fire serpents of Morgoth came upon Gondolin. The full wrath and might of Morgoth appeared over the encircling mountains, and the Gondolin were mustered, their great banners of all colors flying in the wind. These forces were composed of 12 mighty houses. They are as follows. Turgon and the House of the King. They were the personal command of Turgon himself, and remained in reserve in the square of the palace, and their colors were white, gold, and red. They fought under an emblem of the moon, sun, and a scarlet heart. Tuor and the House of the Wing. White swan wings adorned their armor. Maeglin and the House of the Mole. They fought under no symbol and carried two-headed axes into combat. Dwelin and the House of the Swallow. These were the best archers of Gondolin, and donned white, purple, and black armaments with an emblem of an arrowhead and a fan of feathers on their helmets. Agalmoth and the House of the Heavenly Arch. Among the richest warriors of the Gondolin, they had weapons set with shimmering jewels, and blue shields adorned with 7 jewels, a ruby, amethyst, sapphire, emerald, chrysoprase, topaz, and amber. An opal rested in their helmets, and they joined the House of the Swallow as the main archery force. Penlod and the House of the Pillar and the House of the Tower of Snow. Penlod was described as the tallest of the elves in Gondolin. Galdor and the House of the Tree. They donned green armor and fought with slings and iron-studded clubs. Galdor was described as the most valiant of any elf in Gondolin, aside from Turgon himself. Glorfindel and the House of the Golden Flower. This is the same Glorfindel shown in the Lord of the Rings movies, and he was one of the finest elven warriors to have ever lived. His house's emblem was a rayed sun, and he himself fought in armor lined with gold. Ecthelion and the House of the Fountain. Ecthelion, the greatest warrior bar none in the history of Middle-earth, and his house fought with pale silver longswords and marched to the music of flutes. Their principal color was silver, and they cherished diamonds as well. Salgant and the House of the Harp. They wore silver and gold tassels, and Salgant was loyal to Maeglin. A notable coward and described as heavy and squat, he was the only warrior of Gondolin to ride a horse into battle. Rog and the House of the Hammer of Wrath. They were the finest craftsmen and smiths of the kingdom, and they fought with hammer-like maces and shields. Their emblem was a struck anvil and sparking hammer, emblazoned in red, gold, and black iron. It was this house that won the most glory and renown in the fall of Gondolin. As the mighty houses of Gondolin arrayed for the defense of the kingdom, Eärendil and her son Eärendil remained at their home. The forces of Morgoth slowly approached from the north, east, and west, where the south was safeguarded by the eagles. Turgon summoned the lords of the houses, and Tuor counseled him to abandon the city. But Maeglin, driven by his treacherous desires, and Saglant his lackey, swayed Turgon into staying to defend Gondolin, for the king was blinded by love for his nephew, and they appealed to the depths of his heart, claiming the treasures and labors countless that went into building Gondolin would be sundered. Thus, the defense preparations continued, as hot smoke from the iron snakes of Morgoth, or dragons, depending on the version you read, began to choke the city. All the fountains save that of Turgon himself evaporated. The arrows of Gondolin could not destroy the hellish machines as they reached the walls of the city, but the black forces could not climb the steep walls. Then Gothmog, lord of the Balrogs, commanded the iron serpents to coil around the walls and stack themselves. They gathered at the northern gate, and such was the weight of the machines that the gate fell, and countless orcs issued from the serpents. Rog and the House of the Hammer of Wrath and Galdor and the House of the Tree rushed to a valiant defense of the gate. The houses of the Swallow and Heavenly Arch poured arrows into the orcs, but the numbers of the enemy were too many. Slowly, the northern part of the city was lost, and now Maeglin chose this moment to strike. For he knew of the secret tunnel built by Eärendil, and had advised Morgoth to send a force of orcs to ambush its outer path, but then planned to kill Eärendil and abduct Eärendil, taking her to Angband. Tuor fought in the streets below with his house, and Maeglin hoped he would die in the burning of the northern part of the city. He commanded Saglant to urge Tuor to drive into the deadliest part of the fighting, but Saglant cowered and fled, and it is said he ran to his bed and presumably died as the city fell. But Tuor instead sped home, hoping to bid a last farewell to Idril and Eärendil. At his house, he found Maeglin dragging Idril away, though his own House of the Mole was not aiding him. The House of the Wing swept aside the House of the Mole as Tuor rushed towards Maeglin and a struggling Idril. Maeglin attempted to stab Eärendil, but the boy wore a secret coat of chainmail given to him by his mother and was unharmed. Tuor then fell upon Maeglin, breaking his arm as he wrenched it away from Idril. He threw him over the city walls, fulfilling the curse of Eöl set on his son years ago. But the battle elsewhere was going poorly. Dwelin of the Swallow fell to a Balrog as fire burned the city, and a company of Balrogs began to scale the walls and unleash hell on Gondolin. But then Rog of the Hammer of Wrath, in a terrible rage, rallied his house for one last desperate charge. Who now shall fear the Balrogs for all their terror? See before us the accursed ones who for ages have tormented the children of the Noldor, and who now set a fire at our backs with their shooting. Come ye of the Hammer of Wrath, and we will smite them for their evil. And Rog himself led a great charge, his house following him, their eyes terrible with their wrath. They fell upon the Balrogs, crushing them and even using their own fiery whips against them. It is said this marked the first time any Balrog had been slain by elf or man, and it was a marvel and dread to the armies of Morgoth. But then Gothmog flanked Rog and cut him off from the walls. Rog continued his charge, going all the way onto the plain of Tumladen. But the House of the Hammer of Wrath was doomed, and one by one, all were killed. Though they took 7 enemies' lives for each of their own, flame and iron overcame them, and the hopes of Gondolin waned evermore. The elves were driven back, and Penlod the Tall and the houses of the Pillar and the Tower of Snow were destroyed at the walls. The entire northern part of Gondolin was conquered by Morgoth, as the other houses were forced to retreat, though grievous casualties were inflicted on the attackers. Dragons of Morgoth, ridden by Balrogs, now breached the walls. But now the music of flutes began to play, and the crystal and silver forces of the great Ecthelion of the House of the Fountain entered the fray. Of legendary and unsurpassed might was their assault, and it is said in their attack alone more orcs were slain than all that ever fell in battles with the elves in time unmeasured. The name of Ecthelion himself haunted the orcs until the end of ages, and was a war cry for elves forever after. Tuor and the House of the Wing fought alongside Ecthelion, and proved their valor many times over. Tuor himself killed Othrod, a lord of orcs, and a Balrog. Ecthelion slew the greatest orc warrior there, Orkobal, and found himself alongside Tuor as they moved to confront the Balrogs. Of these demons of power, Ecthelion slew 3, for the brightness of his sword cleft the iron of them and did hurt to their fire, and they writhed. Yet of the leap of that axe Drembor leg that was swung by the hand of Tuor were they still more afraid. For it sang like the rush of eagles' wings in the air, and took death as it fell, and 5 of them went down before it. Yet Ecthelion and Tuor were only 2 warriors against a host of many, and Ecthelion was wounded on his left arm as a dragon fell upon the defenders. But Tuor cleaved its foot, and it fled, rampaging without discrimination. He fell back to the square of the Folkwell, carrying Ecthelion, and stumbled and would have surely died if not for Galdor of the Tree rushing to save him. There the western arch of Inwë was held, but by now half the city was taken. Tuor and the other remaining lords then decided to fall back to the Square of the King for a final stand. Among them was Glorfindel of the Golden Flower, who was driven back from the eastern Great Market. They were supposed to be aided by the House of the Harp, but the cowardice of Salgant delayed their reinforcement of Glorfindel until they broke from his command. Agalmoth gathered the surviving women and children into the halls of the king as the square was cleared for battle. Then the armies of Morgoth attacked again from the north, east, and west, with 7 dragons and more Balrogs. Ecthelion lay wounded by the Fountain of the King as the most valiant last stand in all the ages of the world unfolded. But Tuor was driven back to the fountain by Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs. And then Ecthelion rose, and though one arm hung to his side, he leapt at Gothmog, a spike shining on his helmet. he headbutted Gothmog, stabbing him in the chest and driving them both into the fountain, where both perished. The orcs wavered, and now Turgon and the House of the King arrived at the battle, killing a dragon and up to 40 more Balrogs. And there was a final marshalling of forces rallied by Turgon under the two trees of Gondolin, Glingol and Banzel. Turgon repented his ignorance of the warnings of Ulmo, and resolved to die defending the city and bid his people to follow Tuor in retreat. He cast off his crown and climbed to the top of his tower, where he shouted in defiance of the death around him, "Great is the victory of the Noldor." His royal guard stayed with him as Tuor prepared to lead the survivors out of Gondolin. As they went through Idril's secret tunnel southwards, Tuor worried of Idril and Eärendil, who were fleeing ahead of them. Foul beasts and the dragons fell upon the fleeing host, but Glorfindel and the Golden Flower put up a tremendous defense of the rearguard, though at the cost of many lives. Then Tuor saw Idril and Eärendil, who were being escorted by Varanwe and a guard company. They reunited at Garanion, the place of the gods, and also where they had married. Yet now Idril looked back at the city and saw a dragon coiled around the base of the Tower of the King, and orcs rushing in. The two trees of Gondolin were defiled and burned to ash, and Tuor and his company watched in sorrow as the halls of Turgon were sacked. The tower fell into the fires below, marking at last the triumph of Morgoth. Great was the clangor of that terrible fall, and therein passed Turgon, king of the Gondolithim, and for that hour the victory was to Morgoth. Tuor, Idril, Varanwe, and the ragged band then fled to Tuor's house, where they hoped to enter the secret tunnel. Eärendil had been sent ahead by Idril before the fall of the tower, and they rushed forward as the city fell behind them. There a debate broke out over the next course of escape, where Tuor advocated going to Cristhorn and the Eagles, while others advocated for Bad Uthwin and the Way of Escape. Thus a large party separated from Tuor, but here the final evil of Meglin was accomplished, for hidden forces of Morgoth were watching the Way of Escape, and fell upon those elves and slaughtered them all. Tuor's party fled, guided by Legolas Greenleaf, notably not the same Legolas in the Lord of the Rings movies. They approached Cristhorn, the Cleft of Eagles, as the sun rose, and the ruins of Gondolin were shrouded in clouds of smoke. Then Tuor saw on the plain below a company of orcs pursuing soldiers who were protecting his son. Leading 50 men, he fell upon the orcs and rescued Eärendil. The young boy wept at the fall of Gondolin and his hero, Ecthelion of the Fountain. The company reached Cristhorn and its narrow pass and towering peaks. It was a perilous trek, and they soon became strung out across the entire path. Orcs then attacked, with a Balrog appearing and assaulting Glorfindel and their rearguard. Thorondor and the Eagles then arrived, driving the orcs back into the abyss, but the Balrog in the back came into the midst of the women and children. Then Glorfindel leapt forward upon him, and his golden armor gleamed strangely in the moon. And he hewed at that demon that it leaped again upon a great boulder, and Glorfindel after. Glorfindel grappled with the Balrog, cutting off its arm and stabbing it in the belly. But both fell off the edge of the ravines and into the darkness, where they perished. Mighty was the fall of Glorfindel, one of the most legendary and beloved elves of Gondolin. But his part in Middle-earth does not end there, though that story is not told here. Thorondor of the Eagles recovered Glorfindel's body, and it was buried under a cairn, and the House of the Golden Flower wept. Tuor and the others then wandered for more than a year in the mountains, until at last Varanwe found a way into Sirion. They followed the great river and were beset by even more orcs, but now the power of Ulmo rose and they were protected. Through peril and torment they still trekked, until they came to the land of willows, where they rested for a little while and grieved for the dead lost in Gondolin and their flight since. Eärendil continued to grow in stature until Tuor felt in his heart once more a longing for the sea. He then led them further down Sirion, until at last they reached the Great Sea, numbering a scant 580 survivors of Gondolin. Glory dwelt in that city of Gondolin of the Seven Names, and its ruin was the most dread of all the sacks of cities upon the face of earth. The fall of Gondolin was the greatest ruin issued by Morgoth on Middle-earth, And now its pitiful few surviving exiles dwelt at the mouth of the Sirion by the Great Sea. They took a new name of the Lothlim, the people of the flower, and there Eärendil would grow to might and manhood. However, the Eldar were greatly diminished, for their last mighty kingdoms of Nargothrond, Gondolin, and Doriath had all fallen. Eärendil became Lord of the Havens in Sirion and took Elwing to wife. Their two sons, Elrond and Elros, were known as the Half-Elven. Eärendil became a great mariner, building the ship Vingilot with the aid of Círdan the shipwright. He longed for the sea, and most of all to find Tuor and Idril in the western shores of Valinor, where he hoped to beseech the Valar to aid elves and men in their fight against Morgoth. However, the storms and winds on his journey were too much to overcome, and he was forced to turn around and set sail for home. But now knowledge of the Silmaril passed once more to Maedhros and the surviving sons of Feanor. Maedhros deeply regretted the second kinslaying, but the power of the oath was binding. A message was sent to Sirion, but its people refused to surrender the Silmaril to the killers of Dior. And so there came to pass the last and cruelest of the slayings of elf by elf, and that was the third of the great wrongs achieved by the accursed oath. The sun swept down on Sirion, ruthlessly attacking the remnants of the people of the old kingdoms of Gondolin and Doriath. Amrod and Amras were slain, and the ships of High King Gil-galad arrived too late to defend Sirion. They were able to rescue some of its people, but Elwing had fled again with the Silmaril, and Eärendil's son Elrond and Elros were taken captive. Maedhros and Maglor were now the only surviving sons of Feanor. Elwing now looked to cast herself into the sea, but Ulmo pitied her and transformed her into a great white bird, with the Silmaril in her breast. She flew across the sea and found Eärendil on the Vingilot, and the two were reunited. Elrond and Elros, meanwhile, were now in the care of Maedhros, who grew to love them as his own, but felt more burdened from the oath by the day. Eärendil and Elwing, with their sons gone and their people in ruins, felt hopeless and decided to try and find Valinor once more. So they set sail again, with Eärendil wearing the Silmaril on his brow. With its radiant light, they were able to reach the shores of Aman, the first beings to find their way back across the Enchanted Isles. Then Eärendil, the first living man to ever step foot on the Blessed Realm, went ashore and strode into the great city of Tirion. Then Eonwë, herald of Manwë, summoned Eärendil and led him to Valinor, where he appeared before the Valar. Pardon he asked for the Noldor, and pity for their great sorrows, and mercy upon men and elves, and succor in their need. And his prayer was granted. With the support of the Valar secured, Eärendil and Elwing were given the choice to choose their fates, as they were half elf and half man. Both chose the life of the firstborn, and were granted immortality. Then the Valar took the mighty ship Vingilot, and passed it through the door of night at the boundary of the world and into the heavens above. Eärendil manned the vessel, with the Silmaril on his brow as well as other elven gems. He struck a blazing, pure flame in the skies as he sailed, seen from the earth in the mornings and evenings. For Elwing, she remained on the surface of Arda, and a white tower was built for her by the sundering seas. She became a dear companion of all birds, and learned to fly with silver and white wings, and she visited Eärendil each time his journey took him close to Arda. The peoples of Middle-earth named this new star Gil-Estil, the Star of High Hope. And the elves, even Maedhros and Maglor, were renewed with hope upon realizing it was the Silmaril, safe from Morgoth in the heavens. As for Morgoth himself, the fall of the elven kingdoms by his hand and their own had bolstered his strength in Middle-earth and his pride. He was confident he could not be supplanted from his seat of power. Yet nonetheless, a great host the likes of which the world has never seen again was summoned. In it were the Valar, joined by the Vanyar and Noldor who had remained in Valinor, led by Finarfin, son of Finwë. The Teleri sailed them across, but remembering the first kinslaying at Alqualondë never stepped foot on Middle-earth. This marked the beginning of the War of Wrath, the final conflict against Morgoth, black foe of the world. The might of Valinor came up out of the west, and the challenge of the trumpets of Eärendil filled the sky. And Beleriand was ablaze with the glory of their arms, for the hosts of the Valar were arrayed in forms young and fair and terrible, and the mountains rang beneath their feet. The entire northern region of Middle-earth was attacked, with the full might of Angband and its dungeons rising in the name of Morgoth. The Balrogs were destroyed, with only a scant few fleeing into the deep reaches of the earth. Countless orc legions were swept away by the mighty hosts of the Valar. Men also joined the war, with the remnants of the three noble houses of the Edain fighting for the Valar, but the Easterlings remained loyal to Morgoth. Then Morgoth, seeing his end was near, unleashed hordes of winged dragons in a last desperate attack that drove the Valar back. But Eärendil came, shining with white flame, and above the Vingilot were gathered all the great birds of heaven, and Thorondor was their captain, and there was battle in the air of the day and through a dark night of doubt. And Eärendil slew Ancalagon the Black, the mightiest dragon since Glaurung the Golden, and his body fell on the towers of the Thangorodrim and broke them. The Valar stormed into Angband and captured Morgoth, whose pleas for pardon went ignored. The two Silmarils remaining in his crown were taken and guarded by Eärendil. In the aftermath of that final battle, the slaves of Angband were freed and let into a new world, for the War of Wrath had greatly changed the shape of Middle-earth, especially in the north. Beleriand itself was destroyed and sank into the seas. Many of the elves of Beleriand were summoned then to return to Valinor, but Maedhros and Maglor chose to stay. Though they loathed and despised it, their oath remained binding and demanded they look to claim the Silmarils, even though they were held by the Valar themselves. Eärendil responded, saying the evils committed in the name of the oath rendered their claim of ownership void, and they were instead to submit themselves to the judgment of Manwë. Maglor then desired to go west, but Maedhros remained set on reclaiming the Silmarils, as it was by Ilúvatar's name they swore the oath. So the two brothers disguised themselves and snuck into Eärendil's camp, killing the guards and stealing the Silmarils, one for each of them. Eärendil permitted them to leave, saying no harm should come to the sons of Feanor. However, his earlier words rang true. The Silmarils burned the brothers with incessant pain, signifying their unworthiness to lay claim to them. Maedhros, now aware of the full extent of his sins and that the oath was pointless, cast himself and his Silmaril into a fiery chasm. Maglor threw his into the seas, and wandered on its shores forever after, singing songs of lament and regret. And thus it came to pass that the Silmarils found their long homes, one in the airs of heaven, and one in the fires at the heart of the world, and one in the deep waters. Many of the Eldar then sailed west in a great fleet of ships, and never returned to Middle-earth. It was bittersweet, as they now knew the Silmarils could never be reclaimed unless Arda itself was broken and remade. The Noldor who returned were forgiven by Manwë and the Teleri, and the curse and doom of Mandos was at last laid to rest. They were given a haven on Tol Eressëa called Avallone, yet some remained on Middle-earth. These elves include Círdan the Shipwright and Celeborn of Doriath. Celeborn was married to Galadriel, the only Noldor left who had led the first elves to Beleriand from exile. Galadriel herself, out of pride, did not wish to return to Valinor, for she did not want to beg the Valar for pardon. The new High King of the Noldor was Gil-galad, accompanied by Elrond, son of Eärendil. Elrond and Elros were given the same choice as their parents, to choose between the fate of man or elf. Elrond chose an elven life, but Elros chose to stay with men, and in him spawned a line with the spirit of the first noble men, and the ancient and noble line of the House of Fingolfin. Morgoth was thrust through the doors of night, sentenced to exile in the void for all of eternity. Yet the seeds of evil and discord he spread on Middle-earth would linger and fester, and those dark fruits would come to light in the later ages of the world.